The wooded and wide steppes of Ukraine have been the scene of the fiercest clashes since World War II. Ukrainian troops carry out effective activities in the region every day in order to increase their progress in Zaporizhia. The critical front line here is Velika Novosilka. In fact, the Ukrainians were carrying out their big offensive plans in the south of Orujev before this region. But in the last few weeks, clashes have flared up on the front lines of Zaporizhia in the Velika Novosilka region. Normally, the intensity of clashes in Orujev has decreased somewhat, and both sides of the war are now focused on the front lines south of Velika Novosilka. In this region, Ukrainian domination continues on critical front lines such as Storozhev, Blahoded, Niskichny, Mukievka, Levin, and Novodevivho. But the Russian military units resisting in these areas are trying to use their last chance to retake these areas that the Ukrainians captured. The Minister of Defense of Ukraine said in a statement yesterday that 7 settlements were liberated in the last week of clashes in Donetsk, and the area under control is 90 kilometers squared or 35 mi. Russian groups resisting on the Velika Novosilka front of Zaporizhia had to retreat to the city of Staromansky after these settlements fell into the hands of Ukrainian troops. The Russian forces in Staromansky, located in the southernmost part of the city liberated by the Ukrainian army, also dispersed in Orogenia, which is in the east of the settlement. As a result of the hard offensive operations of the Ukrainians, the Russian troops on the Staromansky and Orogenia front lines were thoroughly clamped down. The Russians were forced to take a defensive position as the Western combat vehicles supplied to Kiev were deployed in the area up to Velika Novosilka and Staromansky Orogenia front lines. And these vehicles supported the offensive operations of the Ukrainian infantry units. But almost all of our analysts and experts predicted that the Russian troops would not be able to hold out long on the Staromansky front line. We even mentioned in our previous videos that the Russian troops would retreat to the Staromansky Russian front line, and that the Ukrainians might seize Orogenia. And finally, what we were waiting for happened. Ukrainian forces captured the village of Orogenia located on the borderline between Zaporizhia and Donetsk regions. With the capture of Orogenia village by the Ukrainian forces, the number of settlements in Zaporizhia, which was cleared of Russian forces, increased to 8. This gain meant that the summer offensive recaptured about 100 kilometers squared of Ukrainian territory from the Russian occupational forces. This incredible success of the Ukrainian forces also caught the attention of the Wagner Group boss, Yevgeny Prigozhin. This is actually not the case, Prigozhin suggested, with Russian authorities explaining that Ukrainian attacks continue to take the form of probes by Ukrainian forces rather than large-scale movements of mechanized infantry units at the brigade level. Prigozhin pointed out that the Ukrainian army had captured 8 settlements in Zaporizhia, including Urigan, and carried out effective attacks in the direction of Tavria, and pointed out that the Russian Ministry of Defense was still trying to cover up some facts. These claims of the Wagner leader were reinforced by the statements of General Alexander Tarnovsky, commander of the Tavria Operational Strategic Group. General Tarnovsky claimed that in a single day, around 400 soldiers were killed or wounded on the Tavria axis. Before continuing our video, I would like to remind you again, if you are against the invasion of Ukraine and want to support the work we do with my team, you can like our video, comment, and hit the super thanks button below. The Wagner leader could not stand it any longer and stated that Russia is really failing at the moment, and that if the Ukrainian troops continue to advance in this way in the direction of Zaporizhia, the Russian defense here will collapse completely. Interestingly, Yevgeny Prigozhin openly praised the offensive operations of the Ukrainian forces, although the Russian authorities tried to overshadow these achievements of the Ukrainians. The Wagner leader claimed that the Ukrainian offensive was advancing competently and carefully, and that the Russian army did not do enough to stop them. The Russian Minister of Defense emphasized that, unlike Prigozhin, the Ukrainian army lost M1 Bradley battleships and Leopard tanks in clashes in Zaporizhia. But according to the Wagner boss, the loss of several Abrams and Bradley combat vehicles by the Ukrainian army is routine combat losses. Prigozhin also argued that the Abrams and Bradley combat vehicles contributed a lot to the Ukrainian army, and that Western battleships played a major role in these advances. In other words, the loss of a few of these battleships by the Ukrainian army was not as important as the gains of Kiev and Zaporizhia. In fact, Prigozhin seemed quite right about this, because despite the fact that the Ukrainian armed forces captured a significant part of the front lines in Zaporizhia, they still act carefully and calmly. The Russians, on the other hand, started to work to send support military forces to these areas. The troops of Chechnya leader Ramzan Kadyrov, one of Russian leader Vladimir Putin's closest allies, are also currently fighting to stop the Ukrainian advance in Zaporizhia. But the Ukrainians are determined to destroy whatever comes their way in the wooded landscapes of Zaporizhia. We witness the determination of the Ukrainians again in Zaporizhia because, according to unconfirmed reports, a long-range attack by Ukraine targeted a close ally of Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov, seriously injuring him. In addition, this missile attack resulted in the destruction of many Chechen soldiers fighting in Zaporizhia. The news that Kadyrov's partner, Adam Sultanovich Komov, was injured during the critical frontline attacks by Ukrainian forces between Zaporizhia and Donetsk made Russia even more concerned. Russian war-related telegram channels reported that Delyunov and his entourage were examining the area for possible use by Kremlin forces before the dam was struck and awaiting the arrival of a senior Russian general. Prior to this striking missile attack, the Ukrainians allegedly carried out a reconnaissance and detection effort. Ukraine's drone operators located Kadyrov's partner, Lukhanov, and his retinue using military target detection systems, which combine long-range UAVs and a large number of special sure-trained unmanned aerial vehicles. Then brave drone operators of Kiev delivered the strategic data they received to the artillery units of the Ukrainian army in this critical area. Ukrainian artillery units, on the other hand, launched an intense attack. Anton Herashchenko, intelligence officer of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine, stated that about 200 members of Dolarna's cavalry regiment were also killed in this artillery fire. The Minister of Internal Affairs of Ukraine announced that Delyunov was seriously injured sometime after the attack. Upload-Ikaria, a partisan group opposing the pro-Putin regime that currently heads the Chechnya region, confirmed this critical data in a statement. In addition, many pro-Russian information platforms have criticized Delgado's bodyguard and local security officials for working sloppily and underestimating the ability of the Ukrainian armed forces to detect a stationary military convoy in the open and then strike it with a long-range attack. The fact that Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin's negative criticisms about the Russian army were justified was proven once again with this critical missile attack by the Ukrainian army against Chechen groups in the Donetsk-Zaporizhia direction, because Russian leader Vladimir Putin relied heavily on Chechen troops as an additional military force, as well as the mercenaries of the Wagner Group for the invasion of Ukraine. But Putin's confidence was shattered when the Ukrainians killed about 200 Chechen soldiers during these Zaporizhia offensive operations. There seems to be little left to save both the Russian forces in Zaporizhia and Vladimir Putin from this impasse. If the Ukrainians continue to advance in this way, the Russians may have to withdraw completely, not only from Zaporizhia but also from the Donetsk and even Luhansk front lines. That's how critical the progress of the Ukrainians in Zaporizhia is. Retired Army General Ben Hodges believes that this offensive by Ukrainian forces will not only be successful but will result in Ukraine's capture of the decisive area of this war, Crimea, by the end of this summer. This is an interesting claim, especially considering the overall estimates of only 12 brigades, roughly 35,000 troops for the Ukrainian offensive. Ukraine will need many more of this amount to carry out a convincing attack to retake Crimea. But here, too, the military support of the United States and the West comes into play. The Ukrainians make up for the lack of a sufficient number of soldiers with Western military equipment. Tensions between Vladimir Putin and Turkish President Erdogan have grown like never before. Erdogan has sent Turkish Navy ships to the Black Sea, angering Vladimir Putin like never before. Turkish Navy ships approaching the port of Sevastopol in Crimea have triggered a red alert in the Kremlin. The war between Russia and Ukraine has been going on for more than a year, and the intensity of the conflict is increasing every day. While both countries have allies, there are countries that prefer a neutral policy. While the US and the majority of Western countries have decided to support Ukraine, countries such as Iran, Belarus, and Syria have chosen to support Russia. There are also countries that have adopted a neutral policy in this war. The Republic of Turkey is one of these countries. President Erdogan, who has stated that they will maintain a neutral policy since the beginning of the war and that they will not break their neutrality, does not hesitate to send military equipment such as unmanned fighter jets, ammunition, and armored vehicles to Ukraine. Despite these statements, but despite all this, President Erdogan is on very good terms with Russian leader Vladimir Putin. However, Erdogan's latest move has infuriated Vladimir Putin. Erdogan, who sent Turkish Navy ships into Russian waters without authorization, openly threatened Vladimir Putin. It is a well-known fact that Turkish President Erdogan has been quite tense lately, entering an election period. Erdogan is doing everything he can to avoid losing these elections. It is known that Turkey is currently struggling with an economic crisis and the official inflation rate is over 80%. However, according to unofficial organizations, these inflation rates are over 200%. In order to improve the country's economy, if he wins these elections, President Erdogan is trying to establish close relations with the US and other Western countries instead of Russia. The US and NATO member states officially supported Ukraine, but Turkey did not, which was highly criticized by the US. Now Erdogan is trying to distance himself from Russia and gain a foothold with the US. It is a well-known fact that Erdogan, who wants to provoke his own people and put on a show, often shouts war cries. Erdogan, who is already at war in Syria, is trying to attract the attention of his people in order to remain president in these elections. At the same time, Erdogan, who is aware that he can get the support of the US and Western countries with this move, mobilized 6 Turkish Navy ships in the Black Sea and send them to the Crimean Peninsula. Here are the details of the news. Turkish President Erdogan is aware that he faces his toughest election yet. In recent weeks, Turkish merchant ships have sailed from Turkey and docked in the Russian port of Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula. However, these merchant ships, which were sent to deliver wheat, were not allowed to leave the port with the order of Vladimir Putin. 3 Turkish merchant ships in the port of Sevastopol were forced to anchor in Sevastopol port. It surprised everyone that Vladimir Putin made such a move despite his close relations with Erdogan. However, it is estimated that the reason for Putin's move is due to the foreign manned fighter jets that Erdogan has sent to Ukraine in the past weeks. A few weeks ago, President Erdogan decided to donate 4 Bayraktar TB2 unmanned fighter jets to Ukrainian army to celebrate the anniversary of the founding of Bayraktar Company. In retaliation, Putin did not allow Turkish merchant ships to leave Russian ports. Erdogan, who wanted to turn this situation into an opportunity, sent 6 Turkish Navy ships to Russian waters through the Black Sea in order to shove off and establish closer relations with the US. The Russian intelligence service contacted the Russian armed forces upon realizing that the Turkish Navy ships had entered Russian waters. Russian air forces, as Su-25 fighter jets were mobilized and started to carry out harassment flights against the Turkish Navy ships. The Russian pilots who contacted the crews of the Turkish Navy ships stated that they had entered Russian waters and that they would have to intervene if they did not change their course. When the Turkish Navy ships continued to move forward, despite all these warnings, one of the Russian warplanes fired warning shots at the Turkish Navy ships. The Russian pilot fired a missile far away from the Turkish Navy ships, and the missile exploded at the bottom of the sea. The Turkish crew, startled by the impact of the explosion, contacted the Russian pilots and stated that they would leave the area. Thus, they changed the course of their Navy ships and left Russian waters. However, Turkish merchant ships were still anchored in Sevastopol harbor. Although this incident damaged relations between Russia and Turkey, it was also very important for Turkey's domestic politics. With this move, President Erdogan was able to show off to his own electorate and make it look like Turkey needed Erdogan. Russian leader Vladimir Putin's aggressive foreign policy continues to cause great damage to Russia and the Russian military. Many senior officials in the Kremlin do not support this aggressive policy of Vladimir Putin, but they cannot do anything about it. The Russian leader continues to hold his head high to avoid embarrassing himself to the world in the first months of the war. Russia received open support from Iran, but this support is no longer there. It is known to the whole world that Iran is sending munitions and unmanned fighter jets to Russia. The Russian army has carried out many attacks with these unmanned warplanes sent by Iran. The Russian army, which attacked the residential areas in Ukraine with these unmanned warplanes for approximately 3 months, caused the Ukrainian citizens living in this region to leave the region. This is exactly what Vladimir Putin wanted. Putin thought that by getting Ukrainian citizens to leave these regions, he would be able to occupy them more easily after a while. However, Putin crossed the borders and began to carry out much larger attacks. Ukraine's leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, has repeatedly filed criminal complaints against Putin with the International Criminal Court. Zelensky, who applied to the courts on the grounds that Putin had committed war crimes in Ukraine, presented them with evidence. There are still dozens of lawsuits filed against Putin, although these cases have not yet been finalized. The U.S. administration wanted to take a hand in this situation, stating that the Russian army committed war and crimes against humanity with the unmanned warplanes sent by Iran to Russia. U.S. officials stated that Iran was a partner in these crimes. The U.S. administration, which stated that Iran will be tried for these crimes if Iran continues to provide unmanned warplanes support to Russia, succeeded in intimidating Iran. The Iranian government stated that the unmanned warplanes sent by Iran to Russia were sent before the war, and that no military support was provided to Russia. After the war, however, the Israeli government continues to deny these Iranian statements. The Israeli intelligence service, Mossad, has stated that cargo planes belonging to the Russian Defense Ministry have visited Iran many times, and that these cargo planes arrive empty and leave full. In other words, the Israeli government says that Iran continues to secretly support Russia. The Israeli government, which has displayed a neutral policy in this war, seems to have slowly started to break its neutrality. In an interview with the CNN television channel in recent months, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu admitted that Iran had carried out airstrikes against ammunition and weapons convoys sent to Russia. Prime Minister Netanyahu stated that they were making efforts to identify the munitions sent from Iran to Russia and that they were working to neutralize the convoys. The most critical move came from the Ukrainian army. A convoy of 15,000 pieces of ammunition destined for the Russians on Ukrainian territory was blown up. In response, the Russian army did not know what to do, and incidents broke out in many military headquarters where this ammunition was to be delivered. The increase in the number of soldiers reacting to Putin created a huge panic in the Kremlin. In the last days of the Russian-Ukrainian war, the Ukrainian army started to take different steps. Foremost among these different steps was the identification of supply lines and the destruction of possible supply convoys in this area. In order to put the Russian troops in a difficult situation, the fact that the Russian army had an almost unlimited supply of troops showed that the Ukrainian army could not get anywhere with hot conflicts. Therefore, the Ukrainian army mobilized to make a very different move against the Russians. The Ukrainian army received a lot of support on the grounds of justification of the war. This support paved the way for both quantitative and qualitative development. It was the support that was the basis for the well-deserved victory of Ukrainian soldiers in many battles against the Russian army. It was thanks to the supply of the tanks the army needed and the delivery of a large number of missiles. But the support was not only in this area, but also in the training of Ukrainian soldiers. The most important of these was undoubtedly the intelligence training provided to the Ukrainian army. Thanks to this training, the Ukrainian army has reached a point where it is now able to comprehend every step of the Russians, even before they make the slightest move. And with this, every convoy of the Russian army started to be raided. The Ukrainian army realized that it had a great advantage over Putin. Although the Russian army put up some resistance in Bakhmut, and later it became clear that it would not be able to take the slightest step without ammunition and adequate supply support. Therefore, the Ukrainian army immediately decided to use its intelligence development to its advantage. It mobilized its most competent people in this field to map all the routes near Bakhmut. And later, the special forces team set up by the Ukrainian army began to be directed towards this area. Research has begun for this move, which will form the basis for much bigger steps against the Russian army. And a very critical point was identified by the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army realized that the route near Bakhmut is a very critical supply line. With this, it started to direct its troops towards that area, just as the Ukrainian army was getting ready for this operation. Another information obtained by intelligence revealed that a 15,000-piece ammunition convoy was moving to support the Russian army. The Ukrainian army then started to place explosives at the most important points of the supply line. Thanks to this breakthrough, the Ukrainian army would start to squeeze the Russians in Bakhmut in a very different way. And with the information coming from the agents and the Russian army, it was learned that the convoy was moving. This was the first point that started this operation. The Ukrainian army would advance confidently because the Russians had used this area before. Knowing this, the Ukrainians had a very serious chance of surprise. The Russian convoy slowly began to move towards the critical point at Bakhmut. At the same time, the Ukrainian army took up positions and set up a truly professional ambush point. Hearing the sounds of the Russian convoy, the Ukrainian army waited for them to come to the mines. The Russian army was surprised when a mine under the armored vehicle at the front of the Russian convoy exploded. The convoy had to stop. Ukrainian soldiers immediately started to crossfire. The Russian convoy realizing this, some Russian soldiers tried to turn back but could not act in an organized manner. This paved the way for Ukraine to fire rocket-propelled grenade launchers at the rearmost vehicle. With this development, Russian soldiers realized that they were completely cornered. While some soldiers continued to fight, the vast majority of Russian soldiers had already laid down their arms. It was clear that the Ukrainian army had won the battle as vehicles were badly damaged during the fighting. Some of the Russian soldiers tried to contact the headquarters and ask for help, but before they could do so, the radio was neutralized by jammers, and the Ukrainian army took all the soldiers in the convoy as well as the remaining ammunition and moved to return to the Ukrainian borders. This last operation was very important for Ukrainian soldiers. Putin was furious when he was informed about this operation. Putin has been having a very difficult time lately. The main reason for these difficult times is the economic sanctions, thanks to the fact that these sanctions constantly prevent the Russian army from mobilizing. The Ukrainian army is becoming more dominant in every field. Following such breakthroughs, the Russian army is no longer able to make the slightest move against Ukraine if this continues. All analysts believe that it is only a matter of time before the Russian army raises the white flag and withdraws because Russia is on the verge of bankruptcy. Putin is now at a loss of what to do in these last days when he could not solve any problem. He started to realize that the only solution is resignation. The problems in the Russian army brought by this economic crisis will continue to increase as things progress, and Russia will be left with the biggest problem ever. The steps taken by the Ukrainian army in recent days have put Russia in an even worse economic situation. The main reason for this was that in order to prevent Russia's unjust invasion, many countries, which are seen as the world's economic anchors, imposed embargoes against Putin one after the other. As a result of these embargoes, it is expected that the Ukrainian army will soon gain much greater advantages over the Russians, and Russia will no longer be able to produce even bullets against Ukraine. While economic troubles continue, a major crisis is knocking on the door of the Russian army. It is not yet known how Russia will move against Ukraine with this crisis, but more analysts are capable of shocking the whole world. According to law analysts, the superiority that the Ukrainian army has established in a short time continues to be very effective. This situation, together with its supporters, is actually preparing the ground for Russia to face a great political instability, with many groups within the Russian army mobilizing against the shortage of ammunition and supplies. Things are getting completely complicated. While the Russian army is expected to face worse days due to the course of the war, it is noteworthy that even the ammunition used day by day cannot be replaced. This situation is discouraging many new recruits even before they start. If the situation continues in this way, the Ukrainian army is expected to advance further in a very short time, and in the continuation of this progress, it is another fact that the Ukrainian army is now expected to be in a position to expel the Russians completely from their country. In contrast, Putin's method of actively solving many ongoing problems has become a subject of ridicule all over the world. And in the continuation of this situation, the Ukrainian army is now expected to enter even worse days in a short time. According to the figures announced in recent days, unemployment, which has gone beyond last year, has started to grow like an avalanche in Russia. In 2022 alone, 5.4 million Russians requested passports following the recent mobilization announcement. All Russian youth started to mobilize to emigrate from the country. If this continues, Putin will soon not be able to take the slightest step against Ukraine or even have troops in his army. So what is the real solution at this point? The main solution to this problem is for Putin to take full responsibility again and apologize to the people. It is also possible to say that a big resignation awaits us as a result of the destruction brought by this war. And in this situation, Russia's political instability makes the whole world wonder how things will continue. Thanks you for watching us.